Welcome to the Fox Den Podcast, where leaders gather to grow.
Hello, everybody. This is Stephen Allen Fox. I'm your host today for the Fox Den. Thank you for joining us. We have an exciting session for you today that I think is going to bring you some great insight into leading your team and yourself through transitions, and when maybe that team isn't always the same people every single day or every project that you work on. And our guest today is from Black Ink Presents, the founder of the company. Black Ink is your one-stop shop for creative design, production, and project management and live show execution. They specialize in IP-based live show and events with a future-focused vision for how to engage audiences. And we have here today John Kinsner. Thank you so much for joining us, John.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's going to be a good time. So with Black Ink, we met a handful of years ago with some shows at the Hollywood Bowl you were producing that I was a part of. Got to know each other a little bit, and your company just kind of took off and has become really known as this company that, especially if somebody wants to do something with IP-based experiences or live to film and things, like you're the go-to company. And because of that and all that success, you were approached, via Sony Music and in having a transition where that, Sony would get involved, become a major player and investor in the company, which kind of shifted you from owner, sort of say, into still the CEO, but now they also have a say. And what was that like in that transition, leading yourself and your team through a transition from it's your baby, you're the owner, and now to make it grow, someone else has a say to a certain extent?
For us, first of all, it was a fantastic opportunity to partner with Sony Music and become a part of the fabric and the ecosystem of a company like Sony. So let me say that first and foremost. And when I started the company, I had been doing a lot of work with Disney, and I really admired the vertical that Disney had built between pictures, television, theatrical, and live entertainment. And I felt and I identified early on that Disney was very unique in the sense that they had in-house developed that vertical. And as you and I were working on some Disney shows and I was starting to work on some other shows, I noticed that none of the other studios had really developed that vertical or those mechanisms for creating or leveraging their IP in the live theatrical or entertainment spaces. And so the vision of the company was always to try and build ourselves in such a way that we could eventually get acquired by a studio and help them develop that vertical in-house. And that's exactly what happened. In 2023, we started in a partnership with Sony, and it's been a wonderful experience.
Yeah. And so from the outset, you had this goal to, as you said, become a part of this and this bigger company. So were you already operating in such a way to allow that type of a transition or experience to be easy for you and the team to make that transition? Or did you find that there were things you had to change or yourself or transition in how you operated or how you managed?
You're never sure how a partnership like that is going to change the culture of what you built. And we were very calculated in building a culture that really defined who we were as artists and technicians and managers and event people. And we were very hopeful that culture wouldn't be like super affected, and that we would be able to like translate that culture into, the larger ecosystem of what we were doing. And it's because of our intention to try and maintain that culture. We had actually been approached by some funds, some venture capital funds, about acquisitions before we started talking with Sony. And we pretty quickly turned those down because we were so concerned about maintaining our culture and maintaining our identity and still being allowed to do the things that we felt we were good at. And when Sony came along and we started having those conversations, it became obvious that this was a company that prioritized experiences, that prioritized creating emotional experiences, and was going to allow us to continue to grow the culture that we had been building And from that perspective, it actually made it pretty easy. They were very willing to acknowledge what we had built and how we were operating and what our personalities were and what the personality of the culture of the company was, and allow us to bring that in and try and help build around it.
So it seems like beyond the success that you were having with the product that was being put out there, part of the entire allure of what they wanted was for you to keep that culture. You had created something through your vision and through your goals that they weren't just looking and saying, we want the product of what you're creating. They're like, we want you. We want that to be a part of what we're doing, which maybe that's a good advice for people. Like if they intend to create something that eventually they're wanting someone else to become a part of someone else's company, they need to know up front, who are we? What do we want to be? And how do we strategize in such a way that we can maintain that? And yeah,
it wasn't easy, like turning down the initial venture capital funds that wanted to come in, because it's always lovely to be told, oh, hey, we want to like pay you some money and we want to help you grow this thing. But ultimately, we really had to talk about it, and we really had to, hold steadfast to our vision, and we had to really believe in ourselves, and we had to believe in like the culture that we were creating, and try and find like the right partnership, because we had always built the company for a larger partnership like that, but we weren't necessarily going to just partner with anybody in that fashion. And so we really had to dig in, and we really had to, reassure ourselves, and, really had to hold the line, as they say, until the right opportunity came along.
Yeah. I relate, not nearly at the same level, but I relate to the extent that the orchestra, the Golden State Pops that I had started some years ago, my music director and I, Victor Pezzavento, had created a certain way, a culture of the orchestra. And over the years, there's been outside forces, there's been internal board members that have had these other ideas. Yeah. And at the end of the day, we're like that it doesn't align. And I think that's something, I think you bring up a good point, that sometimes people's vision or alignment will get clouded by the bells and whistles of dollar signs and other things. But the long run, if you can stick to that vision and you're able to build an infrastructure that allows you to support through that transition, look where you end up.
Yeah, it's so true, like, and I think, as I consider myself an artist, as an artist, you have to be uncompromising for what your final vision is. Even if other people can't see it as clearly as you can. In those days when you and I were working together on those Disney productions, I saw very clearly that there were 4 or 5 other fantastic studios that weren't treating their IP and their product in the same fashion that Disney was. And it just clicked. I was like, oh my gosh, like this is going to happen at the studio level eventually. And I think that at the time, I was thinking that it would probably be easier for a studio to build this vertical if there were a couple of mechanisms they could pull in that helped accelerate that design. And lo and behold, like that's how it played out.
So once the transition, once they acquired you, what would you say are maybe like the top couple of things that were different for you from the way you operated before that you needed to adjust?
So what I can tell you is like one of the biggest challenges is leading the team that was staunchly independent and artistic, and we didn't have to like report to anybody but ourselves, and we didn't have to do anything that we didn't want to do, and then trying to take that fiercely independent group of people and find a way to kind of work into a more corporate structure where there are people that you have to send, financial reports to that you never had to do that before. And there are people that you have to bounce ideas off of that you want to pursue that you never had to do before. And, you know, as you grow and lead your team, especially from that space of independence into a space of a larger collaboration with a larger company, there are some people that are going to be okay with that process, and there are some people that are going to be very resistant to that process.
Yeah, I think it's hard when you're working with the team to make them realize that resistance isn't a bad thing,
That's right.
because it brings awareness to the areas where some focus has to be. But in the long run, it can be very beneficial. So so do you have a way? Have you figured out like what's the secret to allowing that creativity and that spark of inspiration that came from independence? How do you protect that when you go into that type of a new environment where, traditionally people consider the corporate world a little more stuffy, a little bit more, it's
Mm-hmm.
less creative. Do you
Mm-hmm.
do you protect those people from that and just keep them away from those things that make that happen, or do you help them to be able to transition through it? Do you have any key takeaways as to how to keep that spark going?
I think the thing that has been like hugely beneficial, I certainly in my career, and what I would like highly advocate for anybody in those positions, is continuing to promote the idea of fluidity and being fluid. It's like a very Bruce Lee type of philosophy. Fluid can fit into anywhere. And it's when you get bogged down with one certain process, and that's the only process that works for you, that's when you start to see a lot of conflict at a lot of different levels, because no two things are made the same in that aspect. And what we were doing as an independent company resonated with what Sony was trying to build. And our creativity is still valued, our work ethic is still valued, what we were doing is still valued. But I had to really promote the idea within the team of there are going to be some new challenges, and we have to be accepting of those challenges because it is for the greater good. It is in the essence of elevating what we're doing. And some things were made a lot easier, and some things were made a little bit harder. But when we were independents, I was like knocking on doors and trying to get meetings and trying to find projects and trying to find pipelines for projects. Well, now we're attached to Sony, and so we're right next to pictures and video games and television and technology. And so we've created this phenomenal pipeline with them, where we have kind of like unfeathered access to a lot of fantastic intellectual properties and elements. However, that does come at the cost of a few more checks, a few more balances, and a few more processes. And so it's really promoting the idea that ultimately is a net positive for your group and for their lives and for really the stability of like what we're building. But it all really is based on fluidity and the idea of like staying fluid and the idea of not being closed off to the idea of changing your process.
I love that idea that you have to be willing to adapt and you have to be willing to adjust things, but you keep them focused on the big picture of what's positive from all of this. Which, to be honest, I've worked at businesses before where there's a loss in the understanding of the connection between the individual worker and the positive outcome from what they're doing. So they lose motivation because of that.
Yeah.
And I hear you saying, well, that you got to keep that motivation up during a transition like this. And the best way is keep them connected to the positive outcomes they're a part of, and that it's okay to adapt and to adjust and to be willing to be flexible, fluid. I love that word, fluid.
Yeah, absolutely. And I used, not that we're that big, but I used the Disney acquisition of Pixar as kind of like my example when I was explaining to the group like what we were doing. And I said that, Steve Jobs was very resistant to the idea of Disney acquiring Pixar because he felt that they would change the culture. And him and Bob Iger came to an agreement that Disney wouldn't interfere with the culture of Pixar as long as Pixar could adhere to kind of the mechanisms that Disney needed them to adhere to in terms of like reporting, in terms of staying on schedule and staying under budget and things like that. And I use that as like kind of an example of like, we're not changing the culture, but we're growing the culture.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Well, I've got to ask you, because this is something that I've thought of a few different times, watching you work and being around what your team does. From show to show, there's this consistency of the product you put out there and these concerts that you're creating, from the Disney shows to La La Land to Rocket Man to all these incredible things that are the Batman stuff that's going on. And I have to ask, when I've been on all these different, not all those projects, but a lot of different projects in a similar way, where you come one time and there's that handful of people that you bring in that are always your team, and then you have certain clients or vendors that you also always want to bring in because they do great work. But even those outside third-party vendors you bring in, it might not always be the exact same people. It might be other people from that company. Mm-hmm. And then when you go from one city to another, from one venue to another, from one orchestra to another, it's different teams of people. So what advice can you give on how to come in on a project as somebody who has, a pretty high level of authority over what's happening with this project, and all this team of people, a large percentage of them, it might be the first time you're working with them, it might be the last time you're working with them, but everybody has to make a great product, and you consistently are able to make that better. Or make that happen? What kind of advice might you have to people that have to work in that kind of environment?
So for us, it really comes down to that culture aspect of it. Like, we are very proud of every project we put out there, and from myself to my two partners, Mike and Alec, every day we are, we're installing what the culture of the company is into each one of these projects. And that's kind of like the overarching idea, is that we hold everybody we bring in responsible to performing at the level that we have, that the expectations we have set in terms of the culture we've created. And there's kind of a lot of sports analogies you can use here. When you have high expectations, but you empower your team to get there, and you motivate them, and you give them the playbook, and you give them the tools to perform at a high level, they're going to go out and execute at a high level. We're dealing with the best professionals in the business, whether they're, the people that are directly on the Black Ink staff or the people that we work with. We have these long-standing relationships with people, and that's what we drive home every year, is installing the culture of Black Ink. There's no margin for error in the live space. It's if a microphone goes out, or if the lighting doesn't work, or things like that. So it's a razor thin margin, and at times can be very scary. But it's really about instilling the pride and the joy of doing these shows and pulling off these events, and installing the culture of the company we've created, which a lot of people, people aspire to greatness. I think everybody, when put in an opportunity to be great, they want to be great. And that's really what it is. It's about trying to lead the organization and lead the culture and empower everyone to be great.
And I guess when you set that standard and you expect people to reach it, the people who should be there will reach it, and the people who don't, they make themselves visible very quickly. Because they're just not, for whatever reason, they're not getting there. That some of that standard of quality that you're talking about, I actually, from those shows, those project management spreadsheets that you guys bring, that a breakdown of the show and what each department is doing. And, prior to working on the shows with you guys, I had never seen anything quite that detailed, but yet fluid. I think what I really liked about it, what I took away, for the shows that I would produce, I would create script breakdowns, but they were never in the format that you guys created, and which department is doing it. And then what I was really impressed by, and I've now implemented myself on my shows, is with that, you're not telling someone the way it's going to happen. You're asking them to confirm, are we getting it right?
Yeah.
Because when show day comes, if it's wrong, we're all sunk. So everybody needs to be reading this, giving their input on where are we overlooking something? Where does something need to be added? How does something need to be changed? And I love that. It's like this collaborative Google sheet, so to speak, that everybody's living in. But it's the Bible of the show by the time it's done.
Yeah. And it comes back to that fluidity bit. right? Like we, as the executives that are running the company, we've asked everybody to adhere to that idea or that concept of being fluid. And you know, you've seen it as executives, we're just as deep in the shows as anybody else, and we take enormous pride in that. You know, I think part of our culture is, as executives, we've never asked anybody to do something that we weren't willing or able to do ourselves. And I do think that's unique in a corporate culture where you have the executives performing at that level and in the trenches and taking that level of pride and that level of ownership and everything.
Yeah, definitely. Well, some great stuff. Some great stuff. Thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your insights and your experiences with everybody.
I appreciate you having me. This has been a really good time.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, for watching the Fox Den today. We look forward to bringing more of these experiences with you. This is where leaders gather to grow. And if you'd like to be connected with me, go to StephenAllenFox.com. And don't forget to look up Black Ink Presents and learn a little bit more about what they're doing. So thank you, everybody, and have a good day.
Visit us at foxpoint.net and StephenAllenFox.com.